Fallout 4 isn't a bad game, it's just a bad Fallout game. If you consume video game analysis or conversation on the internet, you've almost certainly heard that exact sentence before. Maybe not in reference to Fallout 4, but that sentiment has been expressed about so many video game sequels over the last decade or so. From an analytical standpoint, there is value in comparing a game in a franchise to its predecessors. If gameplay, story, or progression take a step forward or back from previous entries, it's important to evaluate how and why things are better or worse. But at the same time, it's easy to let expectations for a franchise color perception of something that doesn't quite line up with what came before. And if expectations are subverted, an important part of a successful critique is to evaluate the reality of the game beyond just describing how it differs from those expectations. Fallout 4 isn't a bad game, but it is a bad Fallout game conveys that fans of Fallout 3 and New Vegas might be disappointed with the fourth entry, but it doesn't tell you much at all about what Fallout 4 actually is. Even the statement that Fallout 4 isn't a bad game rings sort of hollow when it's immediately followed by a very similar pejorative. Games that have fallen into this catch-22 of critique often become victims of uninformed, oversimplified public sentiment. And that's not to say that games like Metal Gear Solid 5 or Dark Souls 2 are without fault, or that they need to be critiqued in a vacuum with no reference to the series to which they belong. Of course not. But it's far too easy for the focal point of discussion around these games to become how they are unlike their parents, rather than what they are as individual works. This sentence, while not necessarily problematic or unfair in itself, has done a lot of damage to modern video game discussion, due simply to the human tendency to parrot concise slogans that, on a surface level, seem to be agreeable and align with our pre-existing opinions or feelings, even if that slogan ultimately paints a picture that doesn't coincide with the opinion that spurred it. Anyways, Project Cars 3. Let's get this out of the way. Project Cars 3 has been the butt of every sim racer's jokes since its reveal in summer of 2020. For those unfamiliar, Project Cars 1 and 2 were simulation racing games. They were never the most realistic in the market, but that wasn't really the point. And they were certainly closer to Assetto Corsa than, say, Need for Speed. That's simplifying things a bit, and it's a more controversial statement than you might expect, but I'm not here to talk about those games today. I just need to make it clear that Project Cars 3 was a significant departure from the gameplay style of previous titles. Rather than an accessible sim, PC3 is instead a somewhat arcadey track racer, lacking many of the more realistic or deep features of the first two games in the series. That paragraph was pretty much all the discussion of Project Cars 3 boils down to, even 2 years after its initial reveal. Of course, there are and were more nuanced reviews out there, many of them positive even. The game reviewed relatively well, all things considered. But inflammatory tweets are amplified far beyond the reach of long-form written reviews by traditional media outlets. All of that is to say that Project Cars 3 is yet another victim of how people talk about games in the age of content suggestion algorithms and 280-character reviews. Examined through the lens of its namesake, it fails to carry the torch. But that observation alone is hardly a thorough critique. Understand that I'm not here to tell you that Project Cars 3 is some underrated masterpiece. It's not. I can't even say for sure if I like it or not. But I am here to tell you that the game Slightly Mad Studios meant to make isn't the game they ended up having to sell you, and it's not necessarily their fault. Back in 2018, Slightly Mad Studios founder and CEO Ian Bell made a post on the GT Planet forums, claiming that Project Cars 3 would be a spiritual successor to the Need for Speed Shift series, the studio's first two projects. He claimed the team wanted to create something more focused and fun than Project Cars 2, without reducing the scale or realism that the series was known for. From the conceptual stages, this game was a spin-off, originally titled Project Cars Revolution, with the end goal of creating a more accessible spin-off in the vein of Forza Horizon or Drive Club. That's not just my interpretation. Design docs quite literally contain screenshots of both. At some point, significantly along in development, the team decided that the word revolution no longer lined up with the game that Project Cars 3 was shaping up to be, and the name was shelved. My research hasn't turned up any alternative working titles, no new subtitle was selected or even seriously considered before the powers that be decided that Project Cars Revolution would be renamed to Project Cars 3, citing that they felt that a numbered sequel would be in the best interest of the brand's commercial performance. Of course, that's not how things shook out. but I want to clear the air on a few subjects before I go any further. It was obvious that the decision to make a numbered, direct Project Cars sequel was a marketing one, and many, myself included, naturally assumed this was meddling on the part of Codemasters, who acquired Slightly Mad Studios in late 2019, just 9 months before Project Cars 3's release. This assumption was not completely unfounded given the publisher's history of questionable naming, but I can safely say that Cody's had no say in the change of title, or any other significant part of development for that matter. Which leaves a burning question, right? What were they thinking? If the team spent over a year working on a spin-off called Revolution, intentionally deviating from the series' history and actively emulating other arcade racers, why would they suddenly internally decide to change course and call it Project Cars 3? Why didn't that set off alarm bells? Well, it did, but there are other factors at play here. Up until the Codemasters acquisition, Slightly Mad Studios were independent. Their games have been published by EA, Atari, Bandai Namco, but crucially, none of them owned the company. The important name on that list is Bandai Namco, who published all 3 Project Cars games as well as Fast and Furious Crossroads, which was also developed by Slightly Mad in parallel with Project Cars 3, and a mobile spin-off called Project Cars Go, which released in 2021. Now, working with Bandai Namco has been described as nightmarish, among other things, and looking at the run-up to these 2 games' releases, I see no reason to question that claim. Tack on an external licensor, like Universal Studios for example, and you have a recipe for a migraine. Crossroads production consisted of a confusing, frustrating dev cycle that left Slightly Mad's relatively small team stretched to their limit. The end result was quite different from what was originally conceived, due to excessive meddling on the part of Universal. Developers had to rapidly adjust to sudden demands made by the movie studio, demands that often defied reality and made little sense to anyone other than themselves. Crossroads was supposed to come out in May of 2020, to coincide with the release of Fast and Furious 9, but for obvious reasons, the film was delayed, and Crossroads was subsequently dragged along behind it like a safe through Rio, until finally coming out in August. This all sounds like the sort of thing that would happen in the 2000s, to companies like Exient or Beanox. Not in 2020 to a respected studio like Slightly Mad. A full dissection of Crossroads is better left to someone like Mini-Me, but I feel like this whole debacle is pretty important to Project Cars 3's story. Not just because the timelines line up so directly, but also because it shows the sort of pressure Slightly Mad were really under behind the scenes, while also embodying the experience of being an independent studio working with a large, disconnected publisher. While PC3 obviously didn't have Universal Studios breathing down its neck, it's my understanding that Bandai Namco were themselves similarly overbearing. Project Cars 3's marketing tried to both have and eat the sim racing cake, and it's not hard to follow the crumbs. A little bit of digging reveals that SMS staff did in fact think this was a bad idea, creatively and commercially. Vocal parts of the team warned that painting Project Cars 3 as something it wasn't would damage the game's image, alienating existing fans and scaring off new ones. Others complained that the decision to pander to hardcore fans was creatively limiting, resulting in many stylistic and tonal decisions being at odds with one another. As much as I consider this game's reputation to be an overreaction, some amount of backlash was understandable. Project Cars 2 was a sim, and Project Cars 3 isn't. And that was already going to piss people off. But then, the game's marketing continued pushing the idea that Project Cars 3 was still made with the hardcore audience in mind, something that, internally, was never true. Ultimately, the individuals that made this decision decided that the backlash was within acceptable parameters. Whether or not they underestimated that backlash isn't for me to say, though I can't imagine they truly understood the gravity of the situation, given that they didn't abandon this plan on the spot. And, well, we know how it ended up. Project Cars 3 didn't do too hot at retail. At least, I don't think so. Numbers aren't public, but sales charts are. And in the UK, first week sales were a whopping 86% lower than Project Cars 2's. In Japan, it sold 2,400 copies in its first week, and ranked 24th overall for retail game sales. To put that in perspective, 2 of Bandai Namco's other video games outsold Project Cars 3 that week, the best-selling of the 2 being Ace Angler for the Nintendo Switch, a fishing game that had been out for over a year. I'm trying so hard not to make fun of this game in this particular instance, because I don't think that's fair or deserved. You know, Japan's not the prime market for Western-developed racing games, and for all I know, there was a killer sale on Ace Angler that week, but fuck, that's funny. In all seriousness, it's not hard to understand why Project Cars 3 fizzled out of popular discussion pretty quickly, and I've not seen too many content creators interested in revisiting it either. Divorced from expectations of realism, tradition, or polarization, Project Cars 3 is like any other game. It brings things to the table, some of them good, some of them bad, and depending on who you are, those things will make or break your experience. I think it bears mentioning that I've not played this game to completion, for reasons that will become very clear, but I've spent about 25 hours with it, and with all of that under my belt, I'm tempted to say I don't like it. I don't think I'll ever play Project Cars 3 again, certainly not by myself, but even after capturing, researching, writing, and revising this entire script, I don't know if that's fair. Because I generally enjoyed myself, particularly in my time with multiplayer. The first thing I did upon reinstalling the game was to jump online with a friend. There are no restrictions on cars or tracks online, so we played Project Cars 3 exactly how we played Project Cars 2. Picking a track, a class of car, and just going to town. And we had fun for the exact same reasons. We were driving a wide variety of real-life race cars on a mixture of real and fake tracks, with complete freedom. Duels were tight, and in the highest moments, I had just as much fun as I've ever had with any other racing game.
I shouldn't have lifted off, oh well.
Oh, fuck! That
You'll
was
probably
not
wanna save
3/10. It's been a good long while since I've played an arcade racer with so much content variety outside of Forza Horizon. And like with Forza Horizon, which was born of somewhat similar circumstance, coming from an established racing sim meant that Project Cars 3 could build upon years' worth of work that was already done long before it was conceived. Drawing upon the matured Madness engine and assets created for the other two Project Cars games, PC3's new gameplay style was able to hit the ground running, with an impressively high quality and quantity of well-rendered content. This game's vehicle roster is among the most varied I've seen outside of first-party flagships. And I'm not just talking staples and favorites, but deep cuts too, stuff that can't be found in any other game. Circuits are similarly numerous and high quality, with the only glaring exclusions being understandable licensing nightmares. And the driving physics, while admittedly a complete departure from the previous entry, are plenty competent. I struggle to find a point of comparison that would adequately convey how this game feels to someone who hasn't played it themselves. People are quick to compare the driving model to Gran Turismo or Forza Motorsport, but I don't think either is accurate. Gran Turismo's cars feel more responsive, but twitchier, especially in GT7. Forza comes a little bit closer, with cars feeling quite weighty in both titles, but I find it still significantly more difficult to lose control of the cars in PC3, even with all assists off. Outside of wet or snowy weather, I rarely felt like I was at risk of spinning in most vehicles, especially road cars. I can't say I'm in love with how the game feels, but credit where it's due, every car feels distinct from the last, while still remaining overall nice to drive. Formula E's are torque machines, vintage race cars lack the downforce, and thus traction, of modern ones, and front-wheel drive cars will understeer if you mistreat them. This game proves that slightly mad understand handling models. Whether the intended flavor is sim or arcade, destined for a wheel or a controller, they know how to make cars feel good. There's a specific innovation here that I feel deserves significant praise. I've caught a lot of flack in the past for using racing line assists, and while I would love to turn them off, I personally have a very hard time memorizing braking zones. I've got ADHD, which makes committing track layouts to memory difficult. And given that motorsports are inherently a repetitive task, I inevitably end up dissociating or getting distracted while my brain autopilots from muscle memory. That's mostly fine, I'll snap out of it if something significant happens, and I've got pretty good racing instinct. But in longer races, especially in the multiplayer setting I do most of my sim racing in, one missed braking point because I zoned out could mean that hours of work go to waste. Not just mine, but people around me too. And landmark-based braking isn't really an option when you race with people liable to obliterate signs and traffic cones on the first lap. Project Cars 3 provides an excellent middle ground between kid gloves and no assist at all. Track guide. Rather than glowing lines telling me exactly where to brake, turn in, and accelerate out, Track Guide simply places 3 icons in midair above each corner. The red triangle indicates the start of the cornering maneuver. It doesn't tell you whether you're supposed to brake or turn in, whether you'll be coasting or using the throttle to rotate. It's simply where the corner starts. Another marker sits on the apex, providing a general target at which to aim the car, but again, leaving it up to the player to figure out how to best execute that. Then there's an exit point, at which point the corner is over. This one is less of an indicator of what you should be doing, and more of a marker of where the game's corner mastery judgment ends. Slightly Mad's games have always included a mechanic that judges how well players are attacking corners. Primarily, it's concerned with your line through the corner, as well as when and where you apply throttle and brakes. Do those things within the threshold, and you'll get a check mark indicating you've mastered the corner. Miss the mark? Just try again next time by. That might be oversimplifying things a bit. It's hard to pin down in Project Cars 3, where the mastery threshold is very, very forgiving. Smacking into a wall or sliding halfway over the curb don't seem to disqualify you from corner mastery.
Or I don't know if they made it for the Nürburgring, but I know that in Race Room there was a challenge to promote the car where you drive it around there, and it was a lot of fun.
That was a perfect corner? That's an absolute fucking joke. A strictness setting, like that of F1's track limits policing, would be a welcome addition, but in a game that's trying to be more arcadey and approachable, I think this is acceptable. The corner mastery system excellently complements the track guide assist. Neither hold your hand like a racing line does, while still helping you learn the circuit and preventing tedious restarts. These aspects result in excellent arcade circuit racing gameplay on beautifully realized tracks in some of the coolest cars in gaming, all thanks to Slightly Mad's experience making racing games. And these conclusions were all drawn after just a couple hours of multiplayer. Evaluated as the spin-off it was supposed to be, Project Cars 3 succeeds in adapting the sim titles for an arcade audience. I was ready to write a glowing review about how everyone was so wrong about this game. There were issues, no doubt. You can't race against AI with friends anymore, and some of the vehicles do not belong in the same category as one another. But I don't know how you could come away from multiplayer like I had just played without a smile on your face. Then I played the single player, and I realized that while many of the best things about Project Cars 3 are direct results of its lineage, so too are the worst. That might sound like it runs counter to the point I made at the start of the video, but bear with me. Because when I say lineage, I don't just mean Project Cars. It runs much deeper than that. I have not played Need for Speed Shift 2 in years. My last proper playthrough took place shortly after release. But even a cursory revisit reaffirms my long-held belief that Slightly Mad haven't devised a better single-player offering since. And that's not really praise so much as a description of what came after. Shift 2's career is traditional and competent, but not much else. On the other hand, Test Drive Ferrari suffers from painful pacing and a lack of variety. Project Cars 1 and 2 both focus on more realistic motorsport seasons, which, while great for a sim, don't work in arcade games. The bar simply wasn't set that high, yet Project Cars 3 manages to stumble. And one thing is immediately identifiable as far and away the biggest issue. It is the number one reason I won't be playing this game's single-player modes again after publishing this video. Pacing. Rather than adopting the tried-and-true method of unlocks via progression and cash income via finishing position, Slightly Mad decided that we needed not one, but 2 experience bars. One for the driver, and one for the car. Eye-roll worthy, sure, but not inherently a problem. However, the crucial change here is that cash rewards are no longer attained by completing events, but instead by leveling up. And leveling up is primarily achieved by completing Drive Club-style objectives in each race event. Draft opponents for a collective minute and a half. Cleanly pass 8 opponents in 1 minute. Master a certain number of corners. Only sometimes do these objectives involve placing well in the race itself. And since the majority of XP earned comes from those objectives, winning doesn't guarantee a cash payout. You'll have to go out of your way to do stuff like hit a specific top speed, which occasionally meant purposely overshooting braking zones since my car was slightly too slow to hit the threshold in normal play. But it gets worse. The same objectives that give XP boosts are also required to unlock new events. Not because events are tied to driver level, that would make at least a little bit of sense. No, car classes and events within those car classes are specifically unlocked by individual objective completion. So not only does winning a race not guarantee a payday, it also doesn't guarantee you'll unlock or even make any progress towards unlocking more races. What this means in practice is that unless you devote all of your energy and effort to completing as many objectives as possible, you will frequently find yourself without any new events available to you. Either because you haven't ticked enough of these arbitrary boxes to unlock them, or because the events you have unlocked require specific subcategories of vehicle, or even specific individual cars. Did you pick the C8 Corvette for your Road C vehicle? You know, the brand new mid-engine Corvette, the car making its video game debut, the car that everyone was going to pick? Well, congratulations, dumbass. You just locked yourself out of the entire second tab of races in this category, because they all require you to drive a British car. This is a regular occurrence. At one point, in order to start driving touring cars, I had to sell my Corvette to afford my first GTC vehicle. But you can't sell the only car in your garage. And I'd sold the rest off to buy the Corvette in the first place. So I then had to buy the cheapest car in the game, so I'd be allowed to sell the Corvette, and then buy the Civic touring car. But then I drove the Civic touring car, and I didn't care for it. So without really thinking about it, I sold it and I bought the Skyline touring car. But as it turns out, if you pick a rear or all-wheel drive vehicle, you are once again locked out of 4 events that all require a front-wheel drive machine. If you pick the Megane, great, you can do those. But the next category says, uh-oh, dumbass, that was a test and you failed. You were supposed to buy the Civic. Oh, and the 2 events after that one require the Fiesta V8 supercar, so I hope you've got enough to buy that too. And of course, this is all assuming you're even high enough level to be allowed to buy the car you need. To recap, you're forced to spend 100 grand on a car for just 1 or 2 events. Then you can sell it, but you only recover about half of the value. Even including the payouts you may or may not get from winning the events in that car, you lose money by doing this, but the game just forces your hand. And sure, I could buy my way into future categories of events, but fuck, I'm already struggling to afford cars. I don't want to spend an entire level tick's worth of cash on the privilege of continuing to play the video game. I'm basically left with 2 options. Replay events I've already done, or carefully comb through the entire class's race events before purchasing a car at all, so I can scroll past the ones I actually want to drive and buy whatever is most compatible with the category. Neither solution is a good one, and in order to fully understand the severity of these problems, you need to first understand that this game is very, very easy. Artificial intelligence has never been Slightly Mad's strong suit, but the pack racing upon which Project Cars 3 insists does absolutely nothing to mask the many, many flaws in its AI. Even on the hardest difficulty, with maximum aggression, I can sail past every single one of them less than 30 seconds into a 3-lap race. A problem that's existed in this engine for at least a decade. I'm not even that good at racing games, as some of you can't help but point out. These AI are just exceedingly slow and exceedingly dumb.
Why the fuck would you
Hello?
put this many
Hello?
AI at Caldwell Park? Caldwell Park is tiny! It can barely fit 8 cars!
Jacksonville 5 p.m. traffic. In other words, you're going to be running in a lot of clear air. But, god damn it, but because winning doesn't equal profit or progression, you have to complete the challenges. And doing so means purposely driving slower. In a racing game, if you pass the AI too quickly, or the game doesn't count an overtake properly, you have to purposely slow down and let opponents pass, or just outright restart the event. So not only was I forced to buy and drive cars I didn't want to buy and drive, I have to drive them slowly, and it doesn't even guarantee a reward. I understand that the solution here, as prescribed by the game, is to continue grinding away on these events until I can afford the cars I want, or to buy my way through progression with credits rather than my time. But when every race turns into a time trial after 3 corners, that's not a good trade-off. Gameplay this numb needs variety to remain compelling, and Project Cars 3 feels like a parent forcing you to eat your vegetables Except instead of being rewarded with ice cream, you just get helping after helping of greens. I was excited for the Supra, but by the time I finished Road D, I couldn't wait to move on. I looked forward to being able to buy the Corvette, only to feel a wave of relief when parting ways with it. You've modeled over 200 really cool cars, let me fucking drive them! This cycle repeated and repeated until I couldn't stomach it any longer and I gave up. And somehow, despite everything I've just said, I still haven't mentioned Project Cars 3's cardinal sin. Listen, I can overlook glaring issues if a game brings something else to the table to make tolerating said issues worthwhile. Some of my favorite games of all time suffer from bad gameplay, non-existent progression, or just straight up incompetence. But personality, that's irreplaceable, and unfortunately I think it's where Project Cars 3 suffers the most. And to explain why, I once again need to go back to 2011. Shift 2 Unleashed is, quite literally, the Monster Energy drink version of a racing sim. It lives in this oft-forgotten aesthetic movement that lived and died between 2005 and 2012. Hyper-real imagery underneath high-contrast adjustment layers, brightly colored filters, set to dramatic electronic music and remixes of rock songs. But where Dirt 2 used that aesthetic to paint rally as a colorful, energetic sport, Shift 2 instead sought to portray motorsport as a thrilling, dangerous, edge-of-your-seat roller coaster. I relayed that some members of the Slightly Mad team felt creatively limited by the decision to rename the title to a numbered sequel, long after it was already conceptualized and partially developed as the exact opposite. Now, I'm not psychic. I don't know what the overall creative vision for Project Cars Revolution was back in 2018, but looking at the end result, it's pretty easy to surmise that the tone and stylization were the first things to be sacrificed. When you've already developed an arcadey handling model and are suddenly told that you have to retain your hardcore simulator audience, what do you do other than change the look and tone? Shift was not the only influence on this game's original concept, but ultimately only two identifiable pieces of Shift DNA remained in the final product: the trademark corner mastering mechanic, and the star progression system, neither of which were responsible for my fond memories. I loved Shift 2 because it was over the top, so cheesy and edgy that it looped back around to being cool. Project Cars 3, by contrast, feels like it played it safe. It was designed to be approachable to new fans, familiar to the old ones, unassuming, and, consequently, generic. Bright gradient buttons, glassy transparent UI, forgettable drum and bass soundtrack. The few things in this game that aren't entirely milquetoast are bizarre enough to give me pause, but not enough to give the game a unique look or feel. Even my favorite moments with Project Cars 3, the aforementioned multiplayer session, were punctuated by shared expressions of disbelief and confusion, not just about gameplay issues, but about stylistic decisions and tonal inconsistencies. I'm not saying that Project Cars 3 needed slow motion crashes, or orchestral Hollywood Undead remixes, but it definitely needed an identity of its own. And unfortunately, that wasn't in the cards. The title implicitly communicated that this was the next game for hardcore Project Cars fans. Slightly Mad knew that was a bad idea, everyone did, except those who could stop it. I fully believe that every person behind this game's development had their heart in the right place, but so much backlash could have been avoided by appending a subtitle or changing the name altogether. Project Cars Revolution, Project Cars Shift, Project Shift, literally anything else would have freed this game of the expectation to be something it wasn't. That would not have fixed the design issues that permeate the experience, but maybe divorcing from the hardcore audience would have given way to a more interesting style, one that closer matched its claimed inspiration. And with that style could have come more outlandish handling, objectives, structure, opportunities to experiment within the game's sandbox. But at the end of the day, what we got is a game that can't get out of its own way. You can see why I say this game's lineage was its undoing. It's the opposite of the Greatest Hits album. It's every problem with Slightly Mad's previous games, rolled into one product. Project Cars 3 is plagued by its legacy, damned for changing, and damned for staying the same.